Welcome, everyone. I am thrilled to be here at Reliability at Scale today. My name is Joe Gasperetti. I'm a production engineer at Meta. I've been at the company since 2013, and I'm one of the tech leads for reliability engineering, which is Meta's initiative for advancing reliability internally. And I'm thrilled that that gives me the opportunity to sit here with some folks who you've just heard from and been introduced to. And so I'd like to start a discussion with them. Please feel free to leave more questions on the thread, and I'd love to get to them. And I'll actually kick off our discussion to start with Sal, since he just gave the most recent talk that you've seen. So Sal, thanks for joining us today. I'm curious, in your work on SLOs, you did, you gave us a good description of what kinds of SLOs we might define or think about. When it comes to actually using them, what are your thoughts? Like, I know you work on some tooling for SLOs. How have you maybe adapted that tooling to specific use cases that have worked well in the places that you have used SLOs?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me, everyone, here. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak about reliability. So in terms of like tooling changes, I've actually like give a full-on talk about this at SRECon last year in EMEA. It's actually coming on just on a year now. And this talk was kind of a companion to that one. The previous talk was 9 things you should do when you start using SLOs, and I talk a lot about how to use SLOs in conversation and how you can use them to start changing your culture and make more or better data-driven decisions. So in terms of that tooling and tailoring there, I think you really have to think about your personas of who's actually making these decisions and what information do they need and in what way. Do these people that like to think in terms of, let's call it like amount of time in which you are unreliable, or maybe the number of occurrences, or what actions do they take towards reliability as a whole? Are they going in and rolling back a release, or are they maybe thinking, oh, wait, we need to maybe change our vendor here or better think our whole cloud strategy. So like there's, I think, a whole many different personas there, and kind of hard to kind of just get into a whole soundbite. So I'd recommend folks out there to go check out that talk I gave last year.
Great. Thanks for that. So I'll move on to get everyone started here. I'll move on to Ankita and Antonio's talk, since they also talked about data, a slightly different kind of data, but data nonetheless, the service dependency graph. I'm curious, how do engineers use the service dependency graph in practice? Is that something that people need training to use, or that's pretty natural to them? What kind of flows jump them into that data?
So the way we have built service dependency graph has been through production traces, right? So we try to capture enough number of traces from our critical user interactions such that we get full visibility on the user call graph. We don't need too many because tracing is very, very expensive. And so we have to be very mindful that in order, like while generating these traces, we are not regressing user experience either. Now, how do we make it simple for our developers to use the data? Yeah, tracing is hard to interpret, and and that has been the main feedback from our developers so far. How do I understand this data? This is too much detail. I don't know where to look, where to get started from. And so our attempt this year was to translate these traces into an easy to understand call graph, which basically shows you who's calling what in what context. You can easily filter that graph on endpoints, your apps, your user interactions, your regions. And so it kind of makes it very intuitive and easy for developers to navigate the flow, understand the architecture, find bugs and relevant areas to, fix the architecture on. Does that answer your question, Joe?
It does. It does. Thanks for that. I'm excited that to have seen some people using your work internally. It's kind of a revelation when people don't have that data, and then suddenly they're able to navigate the dependency tree in a way that they haven't been able to before. Um, on the topic of data, we all love data. Computers love data too, I guess. We have this revolution in AI going on right now, and applying some of these SLIs and some of the service dependency graph to agentic frameworks that can read it themselves is the hot topic of the day. So I'm glad we have Chetan here, and I'm actually curious to ask you about, in the process of building some of these AI frameworks, how have you treated this problem of standardizing data and getting it into your RAGs? I mean, there's potentially infinite data that you could be querying that a person could look at in production. None of it is particularly structured. I'm wondering what that process looked like of curating enough data and getting it into a standard form that you could actually then begin to build AI with it.
Thanks, Joe. I think this is a great topic which we have been working on for like 2+ years now, especially as Gen AI became more commonplace. So one thing I'll say is, as you even saw in my talk, like we went on a journey where we started with like RAG and fine tuning, where we just took whatever data we had, like historical incidents and postmortems, and then tried to use that to make meaningful recommendations. But as you can imagine, that has limited sort of context and ability to help produce meaningful root causes for incidents, for example. So that's where we started looking into agentic patterns, where the AI models can even invoke external tools, data sources, and so on, right? So that's where we are able to expand, go beyond whatever data is available off the shelf, and the different teams can develop their own agent extensions so that they can parse the data, understand the data in a more meaningful manner, depending on their scenario. So again, to reiterate, like again, clean data is pretty important. So we spent a lot of time on making sure that we are not introducing noise and providing noise to these generative AI models, because it's garbage in, garbage out. So we have to have a balance between how, like, the quality of the data and also how extensible the framework is. So yeah, hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. I'm curious, in the process of gathering data, has that actually changed any of the things that you're measuring, where people have to think about the data producer differently in order to get the time structure data you need?
Definitely. So the good thing is that at Microsoft we have a lot of like standard data and observability infrastructure. So I think we are pretty much tapping into that, because it's a chicken and egg problem, right? As in order for these tools to be adopted at scale, they have to work on what is available today. Obviously, we are trying to bring in a change as well, where we get people to have more cleaner data, more observability introduced into their services. But we have to work with what we have gotten today. So that's where we are also trying to, like, one challenge we have run into is, for example, troubleshooting guide quality, because these are the standardized workflows which are manually executed today. And if they are very poorly written, or if they expect a lot of tribal knowledge, then even the agentic frameworks are not going to spin up magic, right? So that's where we are developing a feedback loop where we inform the troubleshooting guide authors that, okay, your troubleshooting guide has these gaps, or make these assumptions which need to be codified in the guide itself. Otherwise, Gen AI is not going to be able to understand that, and then you have the same challenge what human engineers face with tribal knowledge, especially when you have new SREs joining the team, right? So they won't have that knowledge which they need at the time of when an outage happens, and the same thing holds for agentic frameworks or generative AI as well.
Fascinating. Thanks for that. Okay, we haven't pulled Justin into the discussion now, so pivoting a little bit from the data, though I'm sure we'll come back to it. Um, Justin, I appreciated the references to aviation in your talk. Starting a talk with VFR into IMC is a bold move there. Um, I'm curious, you mentioned the spectrum between hacking at home and nuclear power plants, and something that I've thought about before too is like the different expectations for different systems in terms of their reliability. But one thing that I've struggled with is that systems sometimes start on one end of the spectrum and end up on the other. They start out as hacked at home in the garage, and they end up as platforms for 3 billion people. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on like how to, gracefully move along that process.
Well, I don't know if I can come up with something that is going to always be graceful, but it can be more planned and more deliberate for sure. And so I think the strategies that often fail are the ones that are kind of organic or kind of scattershot. In the talk, I talk about these two teams. In the case of Team A, the expectation that they went into was that they could kind of start further to the left on that spectrum, hire a whole bunch of people, and then magically arrive closer to the right side of the spectrum. And there definitely was planning involved in how to make that migration, but I don't think it was carefully orchestrated or planned as required. I've worked on several products that have gone from not necessarily intentionally being in this state of being far to the left and needing to be more to the right. And the things that have worked best in those scenarios are trying to take an ROI based approach or methodology to this. In most of these systems, there are areas where you have more risk, and those are the areas that you want to invest in first. This is a case where you can maybe compartmentalize a portion of your product or a part of your software stack, build up a foundation of high quality and good test coverage and test methodology, and then use that to leverage layering additional kind of rings of quality and reliability in your product. The other aspect of this that I think is really important, especially when you come into a team who has never done this before, is the cultural aspect, where the North Star of we want to get to this point where we are at this point in the reliability spectrum. That means that we have this type of test coverage, these types of guarantees that we can give our customer. And this is why we need to deliver that, not just the what, but the why, right? That's the strategic vision, right? That's where I want to go. But you decouple the execution plan from that, meaning I'm going to chart a path that lets us have a portion of that value proposition at each stage and can demonstrate that value not only to the customer, but also to the developers. So hopefully that execution path means that it becomes progressively easier to operate within the code base. You can operate with more confidence. You have a gradual reduction in the rate of defects that are introduced into the system as you're doing your development. And that way you build confidence within your developers that this approach will actually work. But none of this is simple. It is always simpler if you know where your spot needs to be on that spectrum, and you come in on a new system, and you're like, okay, that means here is the bar. Here's how we're going to achieve that bar. Every piece of code is going to be at that bar. That is way easier. So if you have that opportunity, do not pass it up. That's the main thing that I would say, because the other path, much harder.
I would love that opportunity. I think if this group got together to start a company, we would probably start on that page. But would we have a viable product? I don't know. I actually do want to call on Sal for that as well, because SLO implementation is something that often happens after the fact, and I wonder if you have any stories to share about how you can add SLOs later, or what that can look like as you're trying to change the culture towards measurement.
Oh man, do I have stories there? Unfortunately, not too many I could share in this setting, but like I can talk a bit generally about um, when you have like a target already defined of how reliable you need to be. I think that takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. A lot of times when you're working with individual teams, they try figuring out, hey, where do we actually need to be? What is the actual customer expectation, and not just what is the reliability number we need to hit. I understand for like safety critical systems, you need that there. You need that built in. You might even be regulated to provide that. But if you're working with more of, let's call it like in the business to consumer land or even business to business, trying to understand your user base and trying to figure out what are your targets or your objectives or how reliable you need to be, or even more important, or even that's even harder beyond that, when you need to be most reliable. At the same time, it's maybe a certain time of year, a certain time of day. I don't know. Maybe market open, market close is important for some companies. Maybe Black Friday is important for others. It all depends upon your business and your expectations of your customers using it at certain times, and how reliable you need to be there as well in order for the business to meet its goals. So yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
all I could say in there.
Thanks for that. Okay, I want to bring this actually to Antonio as well, because adding dependency testing, things like bell jar that you discussed, something that has happened after the fact. Like, how have you dealt with, where to start implementing, how to convince people that the implementation is worth it?
This idea of retrofitting recoverability, as we call it when we talk about circular dependencies, is something that has been very challenging, because once you take a bunch of dependencies on your infrastructure stack, it's very hard to remove those dependencies because they're providing core pieces of functionality. The way we approach the problem is similar to this ring model that Justin was talking about. We concentrated on the most critical pieces of our control plane, for example, and made sure we had a very solid recoverability story with them. And then we went on and tackled the first hop dependencies that use those services, and so on and so forth. So the ring model definitely resonates with our approach. But of course, since we're retrofitting recoverability, we're always going to be finding gaps. And that's kind of the situation we're in today. We have to figure out what we're missing in these paths. And once we figure out what's missing, we need to go then and talk to teams for them to retrofit and provide safety functionality within their applications for us to basically be able to recover our site in case of very, very dangerous outages.
Great. Thanks, Antonio. I have now a queue of questions from the live stream. Thank you, folks, for contributing those, and keep them coming. So I'm going to go through one now, since we're on this topic of implementation and cultural change. A question for Justin, which maybe we'll see if Ankita wants to touch as well afterwards. The question is, having standards and accountability helps, but it's not always easy to enforce or follow all the time. Sometimes people meet the standards, but still not the objective. How do you recognize people who put their mind and soul into this instead of just meeting the standards?
Right. So you always have, well, in every engineering culture that I've been in, right? You have those reliability heroes, right? That put their mind, soul, and amazing amounts of time into this particular area. And I think the best way to recognize them, especially as they are continuously evolving and developing best practices in the space, to use that to kind of update your culture over time. So the concern here is that the standards and the way that we're doing accountability don't meet the objective. Well, that is a recipe for a very unhappy engineering crew. I have given you a whole bunch of bureaucracy. I have asked you to check a whole bunch of boxes, and yet every time that I try to ship a diff, it still fails. I can't ship faster. I can't rely on the dependencies that I'm taking from other software components because they're not meeting the objective. And so I think that we have to be honest about the fact that this is a journey. There is no, like, you can't just take my slide from my presentation and say, this is going to be my plan, right? It is an adventure that you have to continuously invest in. And that is definitely the case of what's happening in Meta, right? We are continuously learning best practices. We're continuously evolving what our objectives are as well. And in that type of environment, you have to keep on reevaluating what do you choose to standardize, what do you choose not to standardize, what works as an incentive, and also what needs to be on the accountability side, right? So there is no simple answer here. I'm sorry to say, but certainly the folks that are the reliability champions are a big component of it because their perspective on the problem usually gives you the best avenue towards the solution that's going to work and will resonate, like, not in terms of a bureaucratic way, but in a way of like this craftsmanship ethos that most of us engineers have. And I think that is often the best type of approach that we can come to.
So Ankita hit on this topic a bit in her remarks too about the reliability program maturity model, and frameworks for getting people to move along the spectrum. I'm curious, how do people use the reliability program maturity model in practice? Is this something that comes down upon them from the bureaucracy, or are people inspired to move themselves along the model, or what do you think?
So dependencies is not yet a law at Meta, right? Like, everyone has to focus on dependencies. So what we have attempted to do with the maturity model is to provide a framework for people to think about what is the way to know, how do you know you are done? When do you think you have a complete control and handle on your dependency management? What are some possible steps that you can take? Possible metrics that you can track at every step as you progress from the beginner to advanced level to know that, okay, I pretty much have dependencies under control, but the journey is never finished. The other way is how do you identify the one, who's putting their mind and soul? And those are the incident responders in our company. And those are probably also the people who have highlighted the pain points on dependencies in our reliability surveys within the company, right? And so we are listening to them. And despite the fact that not the entire company is focusing on it, we are working very actively with these incident responders in multiple teams to find the best user flows for them on our internal tools so they can go and fix those outages ASAP.
Thanks. Okay, let's pivot a bit and talk about AI. We're getting a lot of good questions in the thread on AI. If RPMM is guide rails on humans, I guess we need to talk about guardrails on AI, which is the next question. So Chetan, what kind of guardrails are applied to AI agents so that they stay on the correct path and avoid errors, especially in multi-step workflows?
Great question, Joaz, and that's something which we are again thinking a lot in our team and at Microsoft. So I would say two things. One is the first fundamental thing, which may not be that obvious, is setting expectations. So, for example, we have AI-based tools which provides instant root cause recommendations and whatnot. So the first thing we'd tell the SREs and the on-call engineers is that like these are pure recommendations generated by AI, and they're as likely to be incorrect as they're likely to be correct. So please use your domain knowledge when you consume those recommendations, and then you have to ultimately take the final call. That's one. Second is about awareness and risk assessment. So today we are only using AI to do investigation and troubleshooting in cases where it's more diagnostic in nature and not mitigative in nature. So, for example, if as part of a troubleshooting we need to delete a resource, so that's not automated. There might be a future. There might be a future where we can do that, but that's not what we want to do today because it's a crawl, walk, and run sort of approach we are taking. So hope that helps.
Yeah, it does help. I think we're at an interesting precipice in technology here where the topics that you're working on are about to eat a lot of the topics that a lot of us are working on. So I'm excited to see how these things evolve with the addition of AI, SLOs, dependencies, debugging, all the things that we've talked about today. And with that, I'll close it out. Thank you so much to our speakers today for joining us. I really appreciated your talks and the work that you put into them. It's great to build a dialogue here across companies and industry on the topic of reliability. And thank you so much to our audience for joining today. We'll be back soon with some more talks and then another Q&A session.